One other thing I should add is that research has also shown that, yes, demonstrations have turned to violence in the past, but in recent years that has increased for two reasons. Firstly, the police has become increasingly violent itself and has upped the ante. And also extreme anarchist movements, the black box, as they're called, often got involved in the yellow vest demonstrations and kind of undermined them by just they're sort of kind of nihilist in a sense and just inciting violence. So it's become quite a complex environment, and this has spilled over onto the way the demonstration has evolved in France in recent years.
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean C. Fettig, and welcome to 2023. Happy New Year. Recently, two things have happened that have completely changed Europe, in fact, the world. First, Angela Merkel left office after serving 16 years as the Chancellor of Germany. And in those 16 years, she had become revered as a force of stability, reason, and leadership for the entire European continent. She was one of, if not the singular power in Europe directing the continent through austerity, in some places anyway, during and after the financial banking crisis of 2008. She was also instrumental in setting both policy and tone in Europe in response to the migrant crisis of 2015, when refugees, primarily Syrians fleeing war in their own country, but including people fleeing conflict in places like Afghanistan, Nigeria, Pakistan, Iraq, and Eritrea, landed on European shores. Merkel tried to set an example for other European nations by opening Germany's borders, accepting far more than the amount of refugees required by European Union policy. This resulted in Germany taking in over 1 million refugees, a policy that saved lives, but strained her relationship with the German citizenry, especially when it became clear that no other European country would follow suit. And she invested a lot of her own political capital in restructuring Europe's energy system. While early in her chancellorship, she had derided European over-reliance on Russian gas, she subsequently sanctioned, in one case over the objection of leaders from other European nations, the construction of numerous gas pipelines from Russia into Europe during her time in office. This brings us to the second thing that happened to challenge European stability. 3 months after Angela Merkel left office, on February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, invaded Ukraine, destroying a country and upending decades of geopolitics and the world order. This has led to an avalanche of sanctions from the global community and an aggressive response from the Putin regime, some of which have severed the agreements to import gas from Russia, straining Europe's ability to light its houses and warm its people. Taken together, the combination of these two things, Angela Merkel's recession from leadership and Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, have been a social and political earthquake for Europe. And there has been a clear and gaping Merkel-shaped hole in European leadership, leading some to question the ability of Europe to coalesce around a single, shared response. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that figured into Putin's strategy, that without Merkel, Europe would be, at least temporarily, disoriented and adrift. But history shows that unexpected things can happen, and in fact, it appears that European power politics may be shifting away from Germany and toward France. Emmanuel Macron was only 39 and a relative neophyte when he was elected to the French presidency in 2017. In his first term in office, his policy agenda was so ambitious that it generated mass protests, known as the Yellow Vest movement, that paralyzed the country. It got so bad that many wondered not only if his agenda would be imperiled, but if he would even survive re-election. And it's against these odds that Macron did manage to transform much of France's civil and fiscal policy, including its labor, taxation, and pension laws. And he did, in fact, win re-election in April of 2022 in a rematch against his 2017 opponent, the right-wing leader of the National Front, Marine Le Pen. Macron, more than any other European leader, has positioned himself as the director of Europe's response to Russian aggression. While he has maintained contact with Vladimir Putin through the Ukrainian invasion and its subsequent atrocities, much to the chagrin of many of his European counterparts, he has also worked hard to shore up solidarity on the continent ensuring wave after wave of European sanctions continues to land on Russia. Today, I'm discussing all of this with my guest, Dr. Andy Smith, professor of political science at Sciences Po Bordeaux and director of research at Centre Émile Durkheim in Bordeaux, France. He is an expert on France and a specialist of European integration and political economy. He has published extensively on these subjects in numerous academic journals and texts. We talk about how French politics has developed since World War II, how France and its politics are evolving to meet the challenges that the European continent is currently facing, how Macron might be reshaping France and situating himself to be a leader in Europe, and what the future might hold for France and Europe in Merkel's absence and in the face of Russian aggression. If you like this episode, or any episode, please feel free to give it a like on your favorite podcast platform, and or subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. And as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please feel free to email me at deepdivewithsean@gmail.com. Let's do a deep dive. Dr. Smith, thanks for being here. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing good. Thanks, I'm doing good.
Let's start with this. Since World War II, what do we need to understand about French politics to help us understand where we are today?
What's important to know about France, I think, is not everyone kind of gets that, is that French politics had a very liberal past, liberal economic in particular, not so liberal on the social side, social questions. And then after the Second World War, during rebuilding, another strand of thought came to the fore that wasn't totally contradictory with liberal economics, but was more in favor of state intervention. And we had a change of republic in 1958 in France. The Fifth Republic came in, and this gave more power to the state. So the state, what we call the state, the equivalent of the federal state in the US, became more powerful and intervened more in the economy. And we had, about 40 years of that. Since the 80s, there's been more of a mixture of liberal economics and interventionist economics. So France is, in that way, is it's not a unique European country, but one of the things that marks it is this mixture between quite liberal government on the one hand and quite interventionist government on the other.
Interventionist in what way?
Well, for example, at the height of this interventionism, the state nationalized quite a few industries, quite a few large companies in any case, and got very much involved in running big companies. That's much less the case now. It's really pulled back and doesn't get such involved. But there's an expectation in France that the state gets involved in issues which probably in the US a lot of people wouldn't expect the government to be involved in.
The power of the presidency in France is somewhat unique to Europe in that the French president has quite a bit of power. And this stands in some contrast to France's neighbor, Germany, where the chancellor has comparably less power. What's the reasoning behind giving so much power or residing so much in that position?
Well, you're definitely right, Sean. I mean, France is quite a bit different from its neighbors. Throughout Europe, Western Europe, there are parliamentary regimes. The parliament has power, and there is a parliament in France. But since 1958, so that's the beginning of this Fifth Republic, at the time, parliament was in deadlock, and the change of republic brought in this president who had more powers, particularly over foreign policy, but also in certain circumstances, policy in general. And ever since, we've had a regime where there's a parliament that's relatively weak compared to, say, the British Parliament, and this presidency that's relatively strong. And to get us up to date, we have President Emmanuel Macron, who's in his second of 2 5-year terms. In the parliament, there is his party doesn't actually have an outright majority, so he's having to work on a daily basis with other parties in order to get much of his legislation through.
One of the couple of ways that French politics or French domestic politics breaks into the news in the United States is civil unrest and protest. And my understanding is that protest has a rich history in French politics. We're seeing more and more kind of civil unrest in the United States. And there is a definite attempt to characterize that as mob mentality, as uncivil, as illegal and criminal. And I get the sense that this is actually woven more into civil society in France. And I'm trying to understand that a bit better.
Well, that's a very good question. I think one could say that the role of public demonstration, you could say that the 1789 revolution around which the monarchy was overthrown and the first republic came into being was such an example. There were other periods throughout the 19th century where demonstrations were key to changes in events, but often in France, people point to a more recent event, 1968. In your country, of course, there was much civil unrest at the end of the 60s over civil rights and over Vietnam and so forth. And in France, 1968 was a big date too. A lot of demonstrations, beginning with students, but also some trade unions joining in. And really, that was the first challenge, at least for a number of decades, to political power. And ever since, what they call in French the manifestation, the demonstration, I should say, has been part and parcel of French public life. Just a final point on that, you may be making allusion to the Yellow Vest movement, which emerged, it's about 4 years ago now, it's before COVID. And the Yellow Vest movement was a rather unusual social movement in the sense that the unions weren't involved at all, at least initially. And it was particularly people who lived in rural areas or in the areas around cities, peri-urban, as we call them here. And without joining a political party or joining a union, as I said, they blocked traffic and they demonstrated a great deal. Many of these people had never demonstrated before. They didn't see themselves as being involved in national politics in that way. Well, I mean, there's some analysis of this movement as a populist movement, as an anti-elite movement, which in cases of some demonstrators, I think research has shown that to be true, but also more generally, a dissatisfaction with what they see as the political elites of France, well, not listening to their problems. And one other thing I should add is that research has also shown that, demonstrations have turned to violence in the past, but in recent years, that has increased for two reasons. Firstly, the police has become increasingly violent itself and has upped the ante. And also extreme anarchist movements, the black box, as they're called, often got involved in the Yellow Vest demonstrations and kind of undermined them by just they're sort of kind of nihilist in a sense and just inciting violence. So it's become quite a complex environment, and this has spilled over onto the way the demonstration has evolved in France in recent years.
To my mind, there is something similar happening, I think, in the United States with protest movements. And it's difficult to distill out what is organic and growing as an organic movement that is quote unquote legitimate, although I'm not really comfortable with that word, and what is being co-opted by maybe nefarious actors intent on pursuing, again, something perhaps a bit more anarchic or nihilistic, and then co-opting the movement to that end. I feel as if, and this is not unique to France, but I feel as if we're seeing some of that in Europe as well. To some degree, what happened in Germany over the past week with this kind of uncovering of this potential coup attempt, that there might be some of that in there as well, that there may have been some legitimate protest, whether it be actual movement on the streets or simple ideological differences as part of that. And then that kind of was co-opted or perhaps blown into something much bigger and more nefarious. So all of that is to say, I'm trying to get a sense of what's happening today. And I think a lot of the story or the narrative in the United States and in Europe is that the recession and the banking crisis in 2008 led to a lot of cleavages in our societies. And I can think of two that maybe stand out specific to Europe. One is the French and German response to, the crisis, and then, managing the bailouts, particularly the difference between North and South Europe. and how that might have impacted politics and driven some of this movement. And then the other is how immigration might have become a flashpoint as a result. And I'm wondering if I'm missing something. So that's one question. But then if I'm not, could we kind of parse these out? So what happened after 2008? Like, what was France's role and how did that impact politics within France and then across Europe?
Yeah, no, I think that, as you say, there's a lot going on. Increasingly, I mean, research has shown that there's a wedge of French society, probably around 25% of the electorate, maybe 25% of citizens, who have become disenchanted with mainstream politics. Some of them they've got behind the extreme right-wing National Front party, now called the Rassemblement National, but it's still the same party, the National Front. And they, as you've seen over the years, they've done quite well in presidential elections in particular, but without winning power. They did very well in the last parliamentary elections, and they have a large number of seats in the parliament. So some people have gone in that direction, but that hasn't stopped them also from joining in this yellow vest movement. So I'm not saying by any means that all the yellow vest protesters would be located on the extreme right of the political spectrum. Some of them, they just had enough, and as they'd never been involved in politics before, they saw the yellow vest movement as a way of expressing their sense of having enough. Now, what have they had enough about? And I think one of the things that really was a touchstone was as soon as Emmanuel Macron was elected in 2017, he eliminated a super tax on the rich. And this really became a symbol for many people, saying, how are you going to fund what we want the French government to be doing if you're going to stop taxing these? And then soon after that, in the name of climate change, he raised petrol prices, and that was really what set the yellow vest movement in progress, because many of the people, for the reasons I gave before, where they live, rural dwellers or people who live on the outskirts of cities, consider and objectively, many of them have to use their car, and so they're very vulnerable to rises in fuel prices. So all these things, which are linked to what you were saying, a wider shift in public finances that has gone over the 2010s following the financial crisis, I think have contributed to this sense of disenchantment with mainstream politics that has legitimated in turn either moving towards the Front National and or demonstrating with the Yellow Vest movement, or even demonstrating with even more extreme protesters who are even more much more prone to, or even keen on political violence.
So Macron comes into office, and then he supports these measures, eliminating the tax and then raising tax on petrol. And then I situate that against the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis in Europe. And it makes me wonder if this is a problem of policy or if it's a problem of messaging, because the story now is of solidarity across Europe, that there are vulnerabilities there, but that there's solidarity in, the sanctions against Russia or Putin in response to the war in Ukraine. But that comes at a steep cost, right? And particularly as it relates to energy. If this is a policy problem, does this portend potential unrest in Europe and particularly France? Or if not, is it simply a messaging problem that the French and Europeans are much more willing to accept that pain if they have a clearer understanding of why they're doing it? Is that making sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the empirical answer to your question we'll see over the winter as winter really bites. We haven't had power cuts yet, but we might be getting some in order to save energy. That's when things will really strike home on that front. Yeah, I mean, messaging has been probably problematic, but I think it really is a policy problem, in the sense that, way before the Ukraine climate crisis is even more structural and structuring trend, and this government and the one before it, Macron's government and Macron's presidency and the president before it, they sort of played around on the edges. They've been playing around on the edges about bringing in measures to change energy usage and change energy shortages, but they haven't really got stuck into it. They've pulled back from being more radical. They haven't penalized the parts of the economy, and particularly the rich, who use much more energy than the middle classes or the poor. So they put themselves in a difficult position, just as the European leaders, who I think it's very clear now that were completely made a huge mistake in making themselves dependent on Russian gas and oil. And that decision was made, 25 years ago. So we're living with pulling out of that as well. For the moment, things seem to be holding, but that in France, that's at the expense of many measures, many costly measures for the national budget being made to try and get some money to the people who really need it, so that they don't suffer too much with this the rise in energy prices. But I really think we're heading into a tough period in the next few weeks and months, and we'll see how it all holds up. Because I'm not hearing at the same time a very convincing message constantly saying that we need to be more sober in our energy use. One, for the reasons of climate change, and two, because we, alongside Ukraine, are fighting a war with Russia. It's not coming across like that. It's sort of coming across as, well, we're going through a bit of a rocky period now, and yes, it's going to be a bit tough, but put on a extra jumper and you'll be okay. Not a very convincing message, I don't think. But behind it all is a problem of policy and a problem of even a standpoint as regards deeper crises, one about climate and the other one about foreign policy.
So it seems like, especially under Merkel in Germany, but over the past few decades, there's been almost universal and complete institutionalization of energy policy in the direction of, or that being unidirectional. So coming primarily from, Russia and maybe some of its satellites. And given the war in Ukraine and Putin's actions in Ukraine, this is forcing like a full-scale, 180-degree shift in energy policy in Europe after spending so much time building the infrastructure that, could either be blown up or shut off. Yeah. And I'm wondering, what are you hearing as being potential solutions to that?
In France, there's two approaches to that are in collision course, really. One is the pro-nuclear, and that's very strong in France. I always forget the statistic, but I think it's over 50% of France's electricity now is still produced with nuclear power. And there's many other people in France who would really like that to stop. And often they are the ones who are pushing for renewable energy, in particular wind turbines, be they offshore or onshore, and less controversially, everything to do with solar power in particular. So many of the people who are in favor of the renewable option will be saying, well, we really shouldn't be going down the nuclear road, because that makes us dependent on countries that have uranium and so forth. So we'll end up being, well, we already are dependent on these countries, and look where a dependency on fuel with Russia has got us right now. So that's another reason for not pursuing that route. But one of the reasons why renewables hasn't had the success that it has in countries like Denmark or even Spain is because of the power of this nuclear lobby. And they have great power within the state itself. Macron is he's a fan of this form of power, so he goes into supporting renewable energy with the handbrake on, if you like, because deep down, I think what he really evidence shows that he and his supporters, the nuclear option, for a number of reasons, is what they prefer.
My sense is that Macron escapes this because he wasn't really around for most of it. So he escapes some of this criticism. But Angela Merkel, on the other hand, she was a key player in developing kind of the energy infrastructure and relationship in Europe, and particularly Germany, over the past 20 years. And I'm wondering, does the current state of things kind of tarnish that legacy?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, one can understand. I'm old enough to really remember 1989, the end of the the fall of the Berlin Wall, and there was real hope that in the beginning of the 90s that the Cold War was completely behind us, and that Russia itself would, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, become genuinely democratic. And I think most of us probably in Europe, until about 2000, we thought things were heading in the right direction. And so I think a number of the relationships that were set up, including with Russian oil and gas companies, they took root then. What's kind of alarming looking back is that these relationships were clearly not made conditional. And at a time when the balance of power was more in favor of the West, there weren't people saying even more strongly, well, hang on there, what you're doing with your, to the Russians, what you're doing with your constitution and with your, the way your regime is set up is anathema to us. If you don't stop this, we're going to pull out of some of the economic arrangements we have with you. That wasn't done at all. And Merkel was there at the time. I know there's many people out there already pointing fingers and saying where the blame is, but the blame should be shared amongst all those who've been in power over the last 25 years, really.
So let's pivot to immigration. So this has become a flashpoint in a lot of countries, particularly in a lot of countries that have some type of a far-right movement, or obviously in countries that, border other countries that have an exodus of people. But it has become a flashpoint in Europe, and this has been tied to driving nationalist movements. And specific to France, so there were a number of terror attacks in France. 2015 stands out as a significant year with Charlie Hebdo and then the November 13th Paris attacks. And then was it 2016, the Tunisian man who killed 80 people in Nice? Yeah. And I guess I'm wondering, maybe in tandem with some of the economic pain, how has this shaped politics and political discourse in France?
Well, yeah, I mean, this has long roots. I mean, in the 1970s, that's the first time of economic slowdown after the Second World War in France, and in many other European countries, there began to be a more public backlash against the immigrants who had come in the 50s, 60s, early 70s to participate in the reindustrialization of these countries. Many of these people were from ex-colonies of the countries involved. For example, North Africans coming into France. So it's got long roots linked with people looking for simplistic answers to quite complex questions about the restructuring of economies and societies throughout Europe. And indeed, since the mid-70s, there have been these far-right parties, far-right politicians, who have become increasingly effective in broadcasting incredibly simplistic visions of history and of what should be done, whereas the actual reality of immigration is very different from what they picture and from what many other politicians, including in the center-left even, have come to believe. I mean, the statistics show is that immigration levels are not very high in most European countries. So there's a lot of untruth going on about that. And on the other hand, we know full well that many parts of our economy, for example, nursing, desperately needs people from other countries to come in and take the jobs that people in France are either not trained to do or just don't want to do. So you're really right. It's a massive part of contemporary politics in Europe, and pretty much in every member state of the European Union. It's been a major part. Yeah.
So Marine Le Pen is kind of a purveyor, maybe a peddler of some of this simplification or oversimplification of messaging on immigration that kind of demonizes immigration and immigrants. And she has run for the presidency legitimately in the last two rounds, right? And each time she's gotten a bit closer. What's your sense here? Is it a foregone conclusion that Marine Le Pen is a future president, or are there ways to kind of cut this off at its knees? And I guess I don't want to sound super ideological there, but I know there's definitely a concern. So we saw in Italy, Giorgia Meloni But there seems to be more concern with France being such a powerful player on the continent that this would potentially be not catastrophic, but frightening.
Well, the presidential elections, as you know, they have two rounds, and in the second round, there's a runoff between the two candidates who get the most votes in the first round. And what this means is that, well, for the National Front candidate, Marine Le Pen, recently, they'll get the protest vote. Anyone who wants to protest, they're not necessarily voting for Marine Le Pen. They're voting against, in this case, Emmanuel Macron. So obviously that needs to be taken seriously, but I think it would be wrong to think that all those who voted for Marine Le Pen in the last two elections are racist or xenophobic or anti-immigrant. I mean, research shows that, yeah, many of them are, but they certainly aren't all. And just to change tack a little bit, I think what one also needs to bear in mind is that other parts of the ideological spectrum, particularly the center-right, who have moved to the right on immigration and become almost, quite similar to what the Front National is saying about immigration. Mm-hmm. And even when François Hollande was president, so he was a Parti Socialiste, so left of center, you would expect, his government introduced measures that pretty much, Marine Le Pen wasn't against. So I think all these actors, they share some responsibility for demonizing the immigrant, demonizing the non-French person. Well, what one would hope, I would have thought, or what could conceivably happen is that, and there are many actors who do this, but it's not a high proportion of the political class that do this, but they really stand up and saying, well, immigration really isn't our major problem. We have a multicultural society, and perhaps we should be dealing with it more frontally, but we've had one for a long time. Mm-hmm. So, perhaps we should be trying to shift the focus rather than just constantly thinking about controls and borders and the cases of where immigrants are getting in and illegally and managing to stay. Really, it's a drop in the ocean compared to how the French economy is structured. Immigration is not the problem for the economy. That really isn't the case.
So let's talk about Emmanuel Macron a little bit. So he seems to be positioning himself to be like the new face of European leadership. And I say that maybe arguably in the vacuum left behind Merkel, that he's played a continental role in the migrant crisis. He's taken a leadership role in the European response to the war in Ukraine. And he seems to have no qualms about taking unilateral moves on the world stage. So he, at times seems to be speaking for Europe as a whole and on a lot of issues. So I'm thinking about like European national security, increasingly European cohesion. But like we said, there is, some of the things that we've talked about, there is some tension at home. So again, the rise of nationalism, we've talked about the economic outlook in France. So can you help me understand? And the reason I'm asking this is because Macron doesn't really position himself as a far left politician or a far right politician. So I guess we could call him a centrist, although I don't know that that really fits him either. Do you agree that this is maybe his goal, to position not necessarily himself, but France as being maybe the new face of European leadership? And if so, how does he navigate this? And then what's the likelihood that he can actually kind of pivot from German domination in European politics to French domination?
Yeah, I think there's a key point here, that something that's happened in 2016, and so Macron has known it from the start, is the UK's withdrawal from the European Union until the referendum that took them out. The three big powers within European Union politics, for different reasons, with Germany, France, and the UK. And so the UK coming out has meant that in EU decision-making terms, France and Germany are they're the two big member states. In population terms, Italy is pretty much up there with France, but because of the sort of fragmented nature of its political system, they haven't tried to play this role. And also, It goes way back to the French Revolution. The French elites believe that their country has a history of diplomacy and a history of being involved in world affairs. They're on the Security Council of the UN. That's not the case of Italy or Germany, for that matter, for historical reasons. So all these things, they're not necessarily rational things or things that everyone would consider rational, contribute to, in France, it being kind of expected of a president to take up a role in international diplomacy and particularly within European Union decision-making and diplomacy. Another aspect is that for decades now, France has been trying to push a European defense policy. It has quite a strong arms industry itself. So defense spending has always been higher in France than in Germany. So there are a number of areas linked to foreign policy, such as defense, where France has taken a strong line in the past. And yeah, this is maybe coming to the fore. More people are noticing it, but it's not a totally new phenomenon or totally linked just to Emmanuel Macron by any means. But the fact is, as you said, that with Merkel's the end of her term, a new leadership coming in Germany, yeah, Macron has moved to take up the space, to take up the mantle, I suppose, of European leader. That's not necessarily accepted by the other member states very, very readily, but he has certainly taken on that role. Also, because he probably thinks that gains him political capital within France itself. Whether it does or not is another matter, but that's, I'm sure. Well, research shows that's what he and his supporters think in any case.
What do you think his future goals are, his personal goals?
I mean, I think he really, you were kind of musing, where is he on the political spectrum? Well, to me, he's a center-right politician. On economic policy, he's more in favor of liberal economics, that is to say, taking the state as much out of economics as possible, low taxes for pretty much everyone if he can afford it. Not necessarily cutting welfare drastically, but certainly making it conditional on people going and looking for work in sometimes ways that are actually in practice quite radical. Whereas on other issues such as abortion or gay rights, he's very much, well, I think in many other countries he'd be seen as centre left. So he's a liberal in the I'd say the 19th century sense of the word, in the sense that he thinks that individuals should be encouraged to be as free as possible, as free of government involvement in their affairs as possible, and so forth. But then he can be very contradictory because at the same time, his governments have been intervening in many parts of social affairs. So he's by no means a consistent liberal in that sense.
So it seems to me that Europe seems to be maybe experiencing a bit of an identity crisis. And I don't think they're unique. I think the United States is as well. But, for all the reasons that we've talked about, Europe is going through some type of a transition. You can count in here Brexit, the war in Ukraine, which is reshaping alliances and also dependencies, with Germany focusing, turning a bit more inward and focusing on its own defense in ways that it hasn't in decades, the far right nationalism, the migrant crisis. And so I guess I'm wondering, this to me seems as if it poses a challenge to a shared European ideology. And maybe, there's an argument to be made that it's at its weakest points since the creation of the European Union. But you might disagree. I am wondering, though, what are the long-term prospects for continued European solidarity?
Well, European solidarity is definitely part of the equation. The European Union actually has pretty deep roots. It's not just an international agreement; it's a system of law, shared law that's been in place since the late 50s, early 60s, and it has many impacts on the daily lives of Europeans. Economic relations, how goods are made, our agricultural policy. All these are made, structured mostly by rules and norms set at the European Union level. and they have been for decades. So that's what we call the single market. That's definitely in place, and we also have a freedom of movement across borders for the citizens of most of the European Union countries, and so that's something that's appreciated not only by economic elites, but also by people going on holiday or people going to visit relatives or what have you. And for the most part, the European Union has been quite a strong defender of human rights. Mm-hmm. Many argue it hasn't been strong enough. For example, it should have been stronger when Russia started to turn in the way it did 25 years ago. Should stand up to China even more than it has done. There's a whole ongoing debate about how at the European level, just as at the national level, governments should take positions on human rights. So in terms of solidarity, the European Union it doesn't have a budget to have huge European social transfers. There is a regional policy that favors less developed countries and regions within Europe, but that's in budgetary terms it's relatively modest, but it is there. So there are many tools at the European Union's disposal, but most of the welfare states are funded nationally. There are people who oppose, who are frustrated with the European Union for not being what they call not being social enough, not having enough social transfers to help the poorer states and the poorer people within Europe, but they don't have those powers because the nation states haven't given them. So all that needs explaining, and there aren't that many politicians around, perhaps especially these days, who really explain that state of affairs. So we're in a rather strange situation on that front, I think.
Over the weekend, some news broke that the European Parliament may be compromised. Belgian authorities have arrested some folks. They've seized some money, and there's some suggestion that some members of European Parliament have been bribed by Qatar. It contributes to complications with energy in Europe, I would think. And so to my mind, there are two reasons that this is particularly damaging. One, with what's happening in Ukraine and then the sanctions on Russia, Europe is already struggling with energy supplies. And then two, there seems to be kind of a growing crisis of trust in the EU in the past decade or so. And if so, then this doesn't help in any way. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, yeah, definitely on the trust in politicians. And that's a general phenomenon across Western Europe and probably much wider. This problem of trust. And I think it needs to be taken very, very seriously. And of course, it's doubly damaging in the sense that the European Union already has there's a fair number of citizens of Europe who see, for reasons I alluded to earlier, that the European Union is something that is structurally against them and in favor of the elites. Mm-hmm. And this will be grist to their mill. They'll be saying, well, look, we were never in favor of this European Parliament business. Now look at what they've been doing with our money. There'll be a lot of political capital made out of that, and well, of course, the people who have engaged in there'll be criminal activities. Let's just see how it turns out, but whether the allegations are proven and so on. But yes, as in any country, individual politicians, just as individual businessmen, have been found to be corrupt. And this is damaging for the organizations that they are supposed to represent. Whether there'll be also a discourse saying, well, hang on, there's that, of course, but that is not what the European Union is. It does a hell of a lot of other things. And so let's not lose the total focus. These people did something dreadfully wrong. They'll be punished. But let's get back to getting people to understand how the EU is, how it could be even better. That sort of discourse. There are people who would like that be heard as well, if you see what I mean.
What do you think that we can expect to see in the near future in French politics?
Well, I think with Emmanuel Macron becoming to the end of his second, and he can only have two of these terms of president, his successor within his party, there'll be quite a fight to become a kind of the the person to whom he passes on the torch, and that will probably bring about a restructuring of the center right of French politics. So that will be something to watch in the next couple of years, and then also seeing how people on the left of center they position themselves as well, because basically they've been a bit of a rabble over the last few years. They can't agree about many things. They're certainly not one party. They're a collection of 2, 3, maybe even 4 parties. So whether they can build a sort of coalition that the voters will get behind in the next set of presidential and parliamentary elections. So I think I'll be looking out for that in particular.
Okay, final question. What's something interesting you've been reading, watching, listening to, or doing lately? And it doesn't have to be related to this topic.
Yeah, well, I've been reading about some elements in French history that are particularly what I find harrowing, in the sense of their decolonization in Algeria. Mm-hmm. And I think it tells us a lot about, it reminds us about how horrific colonization was, and the clinging on to colonies was, particularly in North Africa. Well, to me at least, it makes the debate and the mess over immigration even more poignant and scary, really, because people seem to have forgotten about what was done in those deep, very dark years, and they don't seem to be aware that we could very quickly slide back there.
What's your interest in France? What sparked that?
Well, I guess partly I came to France 33 years ago to get the sort of job that I wanted to get. I went back to my studies. I went back to do a PhD, having worked outside academia for about 5-6 years. And so I suppose I've never considered myself particularly as a specialist of France, but I wrote the book Made in France, having been here 30 years. And because I've been reading a lot of what my colleagues write about different aspects that I haven't actually worked on as a social scientist. And I think social science in France, sociology, political science, history as well, there's a real an approach that I particularly like, an approach that's not too disincarnated, that looks at the actual actors and who has the power, why they have the power, and so forth. So I guess I've looked at France through that lens, because that's where I've been kind of trained, and that's where I've met these colleagues with the good work they've been doing. But I think many of these questions could and should be applied to other countries that fascinate me as well. I'd love to work on Spain. My Spanish isn't good enough, but one day I'd love to work on Spain. But there's only so many hours in the day. But that's another example. And I'm very shortly going to have a chance just to work on certain aspects of US politics, because I'm involved in a comparative study on economic affairs with colleagues at the University of Oregon. So I will be doing some actual research on the United States, and I'm really looking forward to that.
So I'm going to France for the first time next year in April. What is a must-see in France that is not a tourist trap?
Oh, wow. Well, within Paris, there's so much to see in Paris, and some of it's tourist trap stuff, and don't get too sucked into that. But there's some very, very good museums museums about what happened during the Second World War, during the occupation of France, that are very much worth seeing. The Museum of the D-Day landings, that's up in Caen in the Normandy beaches. That's worth a visit. I think that's been pretty well done, very respectfully done for all the lives that were lost, and the historic moments linked to that. And then, there are some other great cities to visit too, Marseille or Bordeaux. Lots of things to see. Those are just a few ideas.
Dr. Smith, thanks for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
That's good. Thanks.
It remains to be seen if European solidarity can hold, and for how long, against what seems to be a committed and sustained effort on the part of Vladimir Putin to break the back of the existing global order, one that requires countries around the world, but particularly in Europe, to fatigue and fracture? And is Emmanuel Macron the man to accomplish this? 2023 will most likely be the year in which we begin to understand the resolve, the strength of common community and cause in Europe. If Europe remains unified in the face of Russian determination to isolate and divide, and what happens if it doesn't? All right, check back next Friday and every Friday for a new episode of Deep Dive. Chat soon, folks.